mean, kind of like today, where most people don't serve in the military and don't really have any idea of what goes on in the military. And the person you're following in the story is kind of like an exception, rather than a World War II situation where everybody goes in the military,
For sure.
and the exceptions are the one who don't. I think for me, I prefer to have a future civilization where, they're kind of like today, where they're kind of like they have a different viewpoint than 99% of the people in their nation or planet or whatever.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. We enter the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Top stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
All right. Let me clear my throat. Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are 4 veterans, although just 3 today, who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche in fiction. More niche than... What's the newest one? More niche than the ATF, more niche than the TTB.
Ooh, nicely done.
Yeah, the Tax and Trade Bureau, the
ATFE.
ATFE. I got to come up with some more niches. They're out there. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than, is it 70 novels at this point? We're almost at 70.
I am almost finished with my 69th.
Almost finished with the 69th.
Nice.
Yep.
Now I may stop there forever just to say, how many books do you have? 69, dude.
Hey. Just start writing under a pen name.
Yep. Which include the Contract Front and Drop Trooper series.
Contract Front.
Did I say contract? Sorry, Compact Front. That's the next one. You're going to go into legal.
That is a great name for a series.
Legal science fiction, which is a niche that no one's reading yet. You could be the pioneer. Jeff Haskell, who is not with us today, but he is the author of the Grimm's War series, as well as the Wraith and Arsenal superhero series. Josh Hayes, who is the author of the Valor series. And I keep saying operations manager and head of thriller acquisitions at Athon Books, but you're like the machine behind the machine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the oil in the engine.
The oil in the engine at Athon Books.
Kind of.
And I am James S. Aaron, author of the Aeon 14 Sentience Wars series and Galactic Law series. Between the 4 of us, we bring more than 100 novels written. Most of that is Rick. More than 30 years of publishing experience and more than 20 years experience in the military, officer and enlisted. We'd be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. I got to fix that copy. Join our Discord to talk about the show and let us know what you think. Today we're talking about world building and future history in military science fiction. So the kind of stuff you hopefully are thinking about when you go into a military science fiction project and how that is different than what other kind of world building you might do. Like I had a friend reach out recently who had a project that she was working on, and she had a character who was she was just saying a military person who had to make a decision about something that affected the story. And so I started asking questions about what rank is this person? How long have they been in the military? What type of military do they have? What weapon systems do they have? Like all these sorts of things that I hope I didn't kind of like explode her mind, but just made her realize that maybe she hadn't thought about it in a military manner that looks at military problems. That if a military science fiction story is focused on military problems, there's a kind of some groundwork you have to do to make that make sense. So, Rick, this was the one that you wanted to start with. Do you want to give your thoughts on what you do and what you like about good MILSF world building?
Well, I love world building. It's one of my favorite things. When I was first thinking about writing science fiction, I took probably a couple of years just world building a world before I even started trying to write. And of course, I would not recommend that for writers currently because that's wasting a lot of your time. But I was very young at the time, and this was back in the day when people had the opinion that books took years to write. So it was a lot of fun, but I would also say don't overdo it because you can get to the point where you're doing the whole J.R.R. Tolkien thing and writing new languages, and you don't need to get to that point to write a book. But I think it's very important, especially if you're writing a book that takes place in the future of our Earth, to world build, a future history that allows you to get rationally to the point where you are. Because I can't count how many books, and especially it's horrible in movies, where you see a space war happening on an interstellar level, and then they say the date is like, and this movie's made in the 80s, the date is 2019. So we have 40 years to get faster than light travel in star colonies. And that was like a Soldier or Blade Runner. It's never gonna happen that fast unless the technology gets dropped in on us by aliens. So when you think about what kind of a world you're setting up, you need to think about how long is it going to take to get to this point.
Well, so you said rationally. Tell me how you define rationally.
Well, you got to look at where we are technologically, and there has to be some conceivable way to get to where you're going from here. I was going to say, conversely, if you want things to be close to the way they are right now, as far as the military setup with Marines and Navy and, kind of a rank structure that makes sense to people reading now, it can't be too far in the future. Because, if it's 1,000 years in the future, well, 1,000 years in the past, we didn't have the military setup we have now, and I don't think we will 1,000 years in the future. So I feel like you have a narrow window for military science fiction if you want it to be relatable to people reading now, where you can get the technology that you need for a space war without the people being total aliens to us.
Yeah, I can't think of one of a great example of that is contrasting, like, for instance, the timeline of like Star Trek, right? Which the Next Generation's in like 2300 something, 24th century or something like that. And so it's relatively near future, right? Like a few hundred years. And so like all of that kind of correlates to modern day things. And then you contrast that to the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruccio, which really isn't military sci-fi, but it's close. It's more epic sci-fi with military in it, but that's very, very far in the future. And even the way that they travel really affects what they do. And because they've got to go into stasis, and they're out of the loop for, several years, decades almost. And so by the time they get to where they're going, 50 years might have passed or whatever. And that really kind of affects how they do things and how they fight. And I agree with Rick to a point on how far in the future you can go to make things kind of line up with things from modern day stuff. I try to keep it within, I don't know, 600-700 years.
Another interesting thing is when people go really far in the future, it always seems to me they wind up making their military and their government either the Roman Empire or some sort of medieval European nobility.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, like, Raccio really leans on Roman concepts, and which is
Ansbach and Cole's Galaxy's Edge. It's all very Roman-like.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, true.
But I don't know. I guess that kind of gets to what I'm blanking on the word, but like tropey concepts of empire. Like if you have the tropes of the empire and an alliance and the Roman Empire was organized the way it was for a certain way, you know, and then medieval houses were organized the way they were for a certain way. It's like Dune even. I watched Dune again on Saturday, and just the whole idea of like space houses. I was huh, thinking about like serfs and nobility and you know, I was just like they didn't really get too deep into it, but like it
Well,
could have
people who
got
live in space houses shouldn't throw stones.
exactly. They should not throw
Bah,
atomics, as they call them.
right.
There you
Yeah,
go.
but
Well, like what you know, I've been thinking about this a lot in the last couple of days because I've been doing a lot of world building over the last couple of days, and I kind of, when I first started writing, I fell into the practice or problem that Rick was talking about, where you world build just a crap ton of stuff before you actually write.
mm,
And you know, I had on my first project that I ever wrote on paper that I still have somewhere. It's in a notebook somewhere that I wrote by hand. Um, when I was writing that, I mean, I was 14, 15. So I was like drawing ships and like drawing whole fleets and coming up with like crew complements and what kind of weapons they had and how many torpedoes they had and like just a lot of stuff that was really unnecessary for the quote unquote storytelling, right? And I would spend weeks and months, you know, building out fleets and then using one ship. And so what I do now, which I'm finding a little counterintuitive, is I don't build the stuff until I need it, right? So like me, I'm focused more on character and story and plot, and then everything else is kind of window dressing. It's the paint in which you tell the story. So
mhm,
typically, if I don't know that I need something, I'm not going to sit down and think about it. Well, now I'm working on kind of some of the backstory for the main antagonistic force in the Weaponized series, which for the majority of the books that I'm working on, they're more of a background item than anything. There's not really a large scale active engagement that my characters are focused on. It's just happening away from them, but it affects events that they're it affects the planets and the different events that they're involved in. And so I'm working on creating that nation and that civilization and basing it on like modern day North Korea, and then kind of working out how does all that come to how does it become a thing, and then how why are they so reclusive now, like all of
Is
these.
is the dictator of your Star Nation going to sing "I'm So Ronery" at some point?
I'm Showronery. Actually, I instead of like I don't know that I've done this before, but instead of just making them inherently bad from the start, I actually envisioned this world being like the most prosperous world of the original eight expeditions that left Earth once faster than light travel was kind of invented. And they were very popular. And then a civil war broke out and a leader kind of took power. And the 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 original world was like kind of uh based on Colombia and the South American kind of heritage. And then the guy that took power was a Chinese immigrant. And so, like, I've kind of melded those two demographics together. And so he's got a Chinese surname and then a Colombian first name. And anyway, I've been
What's the name of
piecing.
what's the name of the South American country that a lot of Japanese residents and a Japanese prime minister?
Oh, I
I
don't
don't
know.
know.
You
Argentina?
don't
I
remember
hadn't
that
heard
one?
that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
this
don't know about that.
oh, I can't think of it, but there was a South American country that was like that.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I So one thing I think about South Korea, like or South Korea, I mean, I should say North Korea or dictatorships in general, is that they act rationally
Peru. It
within
was Peru, by the way.
Peru.
Sorry.
They act
Okay.
rationally within the constraints of what they have, you know. So I think
For
that's
sure.
always something interesting to think about with their cult. Like, where do irrational elements from our perspective come in, but for them, from their cultural background or religious or whatever, like they are acting rationally. And I think that's
Yeah.
something sometimes people forget, especially when it comes to making a, you know, who the bad guy is and why the bad guy does what they do. It's like I was thinking about that future history. Like I think the military in general is always trying to impose order on an irrational state. But that's what's really interesting to me. Like when you have something that's where the politics come into play, like we've talked about before, where the military characters could be they're trying to impose order and solve something in a military fashion, whereas politics or culture or other things like that can basically create irrationality that then your characters have to, smash up against.
Well,
Well, it's
you're
kind of
talking about
exact.
sorry.
Go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
I was gonna say, you're talking about the bad guys, and that's one thing I've tried to avoid in my military science fiction is making the enemy evil.
Yeah.
Mm.
Because I mean, with a couple of exceptions, most societies and most militaries don't think of themselves as evil.
Yeah.
I mean, you did have, like, for instance, Imperial Japanese and the Nazis in World War II did things that either both of those allies looked at each other and said, "Yeah, that's over the line," considered it evil. But and
Right.
I think that if the general government of Japan had known what its army was doing, it might have been a little horrified. But for the most part, they don't think of themselves as evil or the bad guys. And I've tried to make it clear in a lot of the military science fiction I've done, the old saying that there are no permanent allies, only permanent interests.
Mhm.
And a lot of the people, if the series goes on long enough, a lot of what used to be the enemy becomes like an ally.
Oh, I like that.
And the government changes and the situation changes. Because really didn't want to fall into the trope of making every military science fiction set up World War II and every bad guy the Nazis, which I've seen.
Well,
a
and
lot.
it's kind of interesting when you look at like Germany and Japan, how like, whatever 80 years ago they were our biggest enemies, and now they're some of our closest allies. Um, and James, what you were saying about not thinking you're evil and kind of doing it for the right reasons or what you perceive the right reasons. I've it's not a big part of the story, but this dictator that kind of comes to power because of the Civil War. There's a whole bunch of external kind of intergalactic corporations that are like making moves to take over like different elements of the planet's resources and kind of exploit them from their own. And this guy is like, no, this is our stuff. You're not taking it. And so he nationalizes everything. And after nationalizing everything, he decides the way that we need to protect this is we need a massive military fleet to make sure that this can't ever happen again. And so they become reclusive and isolationist and nationalistic and in a sense become
like
kind of a
Japan, right?
yeah, but they end up becoming like a reclusive rogue state like North Korea, where they don't let anybody in, they don't let anybody out. A lot of their business interests are well, all of their business interests are state run, but they have a lot of external funding from, front companies and organizations and stuff like that. And the reason I needed them to be so reclusive is one of the, and this is kind of a tangent, so I won't go too long, but one of the plot threads that I had originally written was the spy character is looking for basically a criminal who's stolen from other criminals. And these criminals are looking for him because he has a piece of League military technology, and the League is the good guys in this context. And this technology is really classified. And it's very important. And my original idea was he's trying to sell it. And so I had my spy character kind of looking at finance brokers who would be facilitating the deal. But then as I like thinking about it, if this information is so important and so classified, then everybody's going to be looking for it. And this guy would know that. And so he wouldn't want to be like spotlighting himself in the grand market of underworld politics to say, I've got this, come buy it. So what would he do with it? And the best answer that I could come up with was, if it's League technology, he's going to want to give it to the people that want it the most, and that's the Federation. That's the bad guys. And so he's trying to get there. But to get there, it's if the border's sealed like it is in North Korea, you have to have some mechanism to get through, like smugglers or whatever. And so I kind of had the, like the coyote idea of Mexican coyotes, cartels that get people through the border. And so if he's looking for one of those, and there's only a few that can do it, that would give my spy character a concrete target to go after to find this guy. And it kind of solved all the issues I was having with that plot thread. That I just needed to build out the basis for why they were so reclusive. And so I've been doing that. And that, again, that kind of sparked this conversation and the idea of why your futuristic militaries or governments or nations do the things that they do and how they operate. Because I'm like Rick, I don't like super evil bad guys. I think that's kind of redundant and overplayed, and it's way more interesting to have almost an enemy that you can empathize with, and like understand their concerns and their motivations, rather than just an evil emperor like Palpatine wanting to control everything,
Well, I think
Yeah,
it gives you more options in the future too. Like
For
reverse.
sure.
Yeah.
even the closest I've come to like a really evil bad guy, not evil, but he was sadistic, and brutal. I still made him have justification in his own mind for what he did.
Yeah.
He felt like, I mean, and some real justification too, even in real life, because he was part of a genetically engineered species that had been slaves for the old empire. The empire broke up a long time ago, but he still hates humans, and all of them hate humans because they were created as slaves for them. So everything he did, he had a good reason for it.
I made this mistake in the Valor trilogy. Well, one of the mistakes was I wrote Edge of Valor as a standalone, and didn't think I was going to do a series. So I had to come up with plot for the other two books. But I originally had based it in this universe where the bad guys, who I called the Pegasi, were kind of like a telepathic, um, almost not post-human, but augmented human species. And they worshipped their boy king, who was just a clone of the same entity over and over again, but he maintained the image of a boy for whatever reason. I never really kind of figured that out. But I took that idea and I ran with it in Valor, and the underlying conspiracy, the cardinal conspiracy in Valor, kind of came from this idea of just a former Pegasi who was involved in a conflict many years ago and lost his family, and he was done with everything, and so he wanted to take over everything. But I never really got to flesh that out, and I never really got to play with that idea. It was like taking Hydra and like bumping it up like to factor of 1,000 and just making it this galaxy spanning conspiracy that I really didn't get to do anything with. It was just the backdrop for all the elements that happened in the story. And so with Weaponized, I'm trying to not go so world ending, if that makes sense, with my conflict. I don't want to have like a fight for humanity's existence. Just because like that has a place, and I think that there's a number of authors and stories that do that justice, but at the same time it's kind of overplayed. And I think that if you can create characters in a setting where you care about what happens to them individually, um, caring about a large civilization falling that you have no idea about really is, in my mind, it's difficult to generate that kind of um, intensity, right? It's kind of like in Star Wars, they make it as we have to stop the Emperor or the entire galaxy's at risk. Well, in the original trilogy, I kind of felt like the I was more worried about the characters than anybody else in the galaxy. You know, I was worried about what happened to Han and Luke and Leia, and I didn't really care about who lived on Tatooine or any of these other places. But you're led to believe that if the Empire succeeds, that everybody's at risk. And I try to like make the stakes as small as possible, but heighten them to a personal level instead of a galactic level.
Um, Another thing I was thinking about, and this ties in with what you said about the whole time, the whole future history level, is how to put this. You have to have like a main character who is in a place where um, there's individual, what's the word I'm looking for? Autonomy, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Where because I mean, you can do it with where the main character is in some sort of autocracy and he's forced to be a soldier. Um, and that's a different kind of military science fiction. But I think for me, I like having where the main character makes a decision to be part of the war, to be part of the conflict, which means you need to have a future and a place where he gets to make that decision. If not everybody does, at least that character does. I feel like that's, I mean, if you want to set your book up by like the whole hero's journey, type of deal, they have to answer the call.
Right.
And if they're not called, if they're just drafted, pressed into service, then you can still have a good military science fiction story, but I feel like he's not fighting for a greater cause. He's just fighting to survive against the enemy and the army he's fighting for. But that's a different kind of story, though. I don't think I've told one exactly like that, but other people have. But for me, I like having a little bit a future civilization where most people. I mean, kind of like today, where most people don't serve in the military and don't really have any idea of what goes on in the military. And the person you're following in the story is kind of like an exception rather than a World War II situation where everybody goes in the military,
For sure.
and the exceptions are the one who don't. I think for me, I prefer to have a future civilization where, they're kind of like today, where they're kind of like they have a different viewpoint than 99% of the people in their nation or plan or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that point kind of gets lost a little bit and underappreciated in that in all civilizations, the military is kind of a small fraction of the general population of any nation or country, and um, even during World War II or some of the biggest wars in history, there was still other things that were happening. Like still people like still lived their lives. They still went to work.
There were people that almost could pretend there was no war.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
exactly.
even in the United States, though,
Right.
I mean, the way my dad told it, if you were somebody who was between the ages of 18 and 30 and you weren't in the military, people looked at you funny, like, what's wrong with you?
For sure.
But that's
and I think
like an exception rather than rule. I mean, there's
It's
only
such
been
a
a couple
unique
of times
circumstance.
in our history where
yeah,
that's
yeah,
been
for
the
sure.
case.
Well, and I think too, like even in modern day, where we talk about like, well, the biggest modern war, the Afghanistan conflict, and everything that happened over there, like, um, again, the military is a small fraction of the people that experience that, but for the most of the American civilization or the United States population anyway, we knew about the war, like we
Right.
knew it was going on, like we experienced it in kind of a tangential, like distant way, but for the most part, life went on,
What's the
right? Like
thing
people went
we always used to say, like, we're at war while America's at the mall.
100%. Yeah. People, I mean, myself included, like, I was in the military and I never, either fortunately or unfortunately was sent to the conflict. I never experienced combat in that setting. And I went to baseball games and barbecues and thought about it and knew it was going on, but it didn't really affect my day to day. And I think, in my opinion, anyway, um, not focusing on it, but presenting that in military science fiction, I think is important. Um, just because it gives depth to your world and your universe rather than, like Warhammer 40,000. It's all war all the time, and that's all it's focused on.
All
But
war all the time.
I know.
yeah, but most civilizations, they have even if they're at war, they have other elements that are not. And if you can develop those in a way that you can show those aspects of life uh, on top of the conflict that you're writing about, that gives a lot of credibility and depth to your story that otherwise you might not have.
Mhm.
I mean, it's hard to do if you're doing, like we've talked about, like small combat tactics and special operations. And if you're focusing on that kind of a story, then it is kind of hard to flesh a lot of that background stuff out. But I think if you're doing, even if you're doing a galaxy spanning, like kind of world war, if you will, that I think you could find a lot of places where you could uh, show a lot of that extra um, kind of tangential things to your story that really kind of flesh it out and make it feel like a real actual place instead of just a distant unnamed planet somewhere that you're fighting over a rock. You know what I mean?
But one of the things that has become that we're increasingly experiencing, in the modern military is the fact that, like, you could be a drone operator in California running a drone in Afghanistan or wherever, Poland now, um, or Ukraine. But, and then, even when I was in, like, it was just so weird that, like, you know, the Frankfurt airport is an hour away and I could go to Ramstein and be in Iraq in, 4 hours. It's just crazy. And
Yeah.
you see people sitting in the airport that, like, had obviously just, like, they had Iraqi sand in their boots. Like, and that, like, that sort of transition where, it used to be such a long process, like, to go somewhere or go, like, I'm going to deploy for war and it's going to take, months. And the world is just so much smaller now. And even
Yeah.
imagining a future, like we've talked about interstellar travel and, with like something like cryosleep, that transition could be instantaneous or it could take, months. But you're right. I think considering all those aspects of the culture, why they're there, why they're at war, what the people think and feel about what they're doing and why they're fighting, and what the scope of that is going to give you so much more depth.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of some examples of, like, because there definitely is a place, and sometimes I've just enjoyed the rah, we're just going to go kill the enemy. But from an artistic perspective, I guess I should say, like, somebody is trying to, like, communicate the experience of a soldier. Um, that's definitely something that I appreciate, and I think there's definitely an audience for that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
We were talking about the different types of empire or governments that we modeled future governments after. And we were saying, like, a lot of people model it after the Roman Empire, but I've always thought that a better fit pragmatically and dramatically, in a way, would be the British trade empire in, like,
Oh,
the
yeah.
18th century, because the Roman Empire, if they were more hands-on, I guess I should say. The British trade empire was more like, we just want your goods, and as long as you don't do anything that interrupts that market, we're okay. if you interrupt that market, then we're gonna slaughter you and put somebody else in power. But I feel like that would be more of a model. I think to some extent, I think like David Weber with um,
Honor Harrington.
yeah, with the name of the government I'm trying to think of.
Manticore.
Manticore, thank you.
Yeah.
That they're kind of that, more of a British setup than they
Yeah.
are Roman. But a lot of science fiction, especially military science fiction writers, seem to think that any empire in the future is going to be the Roman Empire. So it's
Well, or that
refreshing
it's
to read something
like,
different.
or that it's like a massive part of the civilization's infrastructure, right? Like,
Mhm.
of course, the United States have a huge military industrial complex, but the majority of nations don't have. I mean, you look at the European nations; they all have militaries, but in my opinion, anyway, like you don't talk about the German or the French or the Spanish military in the same way that you talk about the U.S. military, just because it's such a big. The U.S. military is such a big part of our way of life, basically, and um, many nations, the military is just a small aspect of
Well,
who they are as a
that's the
country,
thing for the modern world. I mean, it didn't used to be that way.
for
Right.
sure.
We kind of made it that way after World War II when we said, let us be your military and you just let us put, bases in your country. And to be fair, a lot of them had lost a good portion of their population and their economy in World War II and couldn't really afford to rebuild the military. And we stepped in and said, you don't have to. And
Right.
Exactly.
so
Well,
Right.
I went
that's
down the
really
rabbit
key.
hole recently on like French sort of policy design around their military. And
Mhm.
I didn't realize that the French are basically focused on power projection with nuclear. Like they're the might be the only nation aside from the US that reserves the right to first nuclear strike. Um,
I
and
didn't
they,
know that.
yeah, then they maintain a submarine fleet. They have, or with nuclear capabilities. And then
French have nuclear like
I
missile
don't think they have
subs.
they,
ICBMs.
they,
Oh,
well,
missile subs,
they
yeah.
don't need them really because they're
Yeah.
targeting locations. Like, yeah, they have launch locations throughout France. And then they also maintain, it's not a robust, it was only like 3 or 4 subs,
Oh, okay.
I think. But I mean, that's enough to, ruin somebody's day. But that
Yeah.
was interesting to me that NATO I didn't realize, I should know this, but that just they had more of a plan, like dividing up amongst nations. Like Germany has more of the ground forces. I mean, they're the ones that were like on the Russian border, but or at least not on the Russian border, but closer. Um, but then also like as France continues to kind of play their like managing former colonial uh things, and like they've been active in Syria, and I hadn't realized that as much of that. Like, so there are like thinking about a nation analog where they don't have nearly the resources we have, but they still leverage them in ways that, protect their interests, um, was interesting. And I think that's like, if you're looking for world building, I want to look at a nation like getting to that sort of like merchant protecting, like the British were definitely protecting trade routes and we're seizing territory, but then France is, I mean, they kind of did the same thing. Like, I really don't know a lot about like French, like how they were moving stuff between colonies or if they were depending on the British for that. Um, but those are
When?
all, I think those are
At what
interesting
time
analogs
period?
to look at. Well, I'm thinking more like into China and, so this
Oh,
would be, you know, late 19th century into the 20th, like as Austria, because I mean they were mostly what, North Africa and into China with Vietnam and former, all those areas. But I don't know how they moved. I don't know anything about their trade routes. But you're right, like the military exists to protect the trade routes and secure territory and resources in the territory. Um, and then all that has now gotten to a place where maybe it's prestige. I don't know why they're in North Africa. I didn't look at what
um,
their goals are there.
well, I feel like I don't know if it's prestige so much as they feel an obligation.
Yeah.
I mean, because anybody from one of their colonies is a French citizen and can come to France.
Hmm.
Like the Algeria, they can just go to France and live there. You know, they don't have to ask for a visa or a passport. They just go. It's
Mhm.
their country. I think
Well,
maybe
and
they
I look at
maybe they're
I
making
really
up for what they did in, in the
Right.
19th century.
Right.
I really try hard to like I base some of my military and some of my civilizations obviously on the United States model, just because that's what I know. But I try really hard to meld that with other geopolitical environments, because we're one of the I think every nation in the world has protectorates, and like you said, like France has different colonies and different points of interest, and I think every nation has those for the most part, well developed countries anyway. But I think the United States is really the only one that has like a massive amount of uh bases and installations that are in other countries. Like no other country has a base in America, right? and
Right.
and I while that is kind of it's worked for us, and obviously for the countries that we're in, and bolstering their defensive capabilities and all of that, it's not standard. It's not even prevalent in the rest of the world. And so I try to take a lot of that into account, and create uh governmental structures that are not wholly based or interpreted from the U.S. military and the U.S. government system. Um, I think there's a lot of military fiction that is obviously written by United States veterans and even people that aren't. And sometimes I think that you can overplay, kind of like with the big bad, you can overplay uh, the wealth and the technology of your protagonist military in kind of unconsciously, just because, like, as Americans we look at the US military as the best and the biggest military, right? But there's other militaries that are just as trained and skilled, and may not be on the level of size as ours, but they're still competent. And same thing with other governments too. And so I really try to extrapolate a lot of different government structures, to make it, I don't know, just to make it it's more interesting that way, I think.
No, I think in general, people, it's like people rise to the challenge. And I think oftentimes there's a sort of elitism or whatever with, the US. And then you go and
Yeah.
interact with people in other militaries and you realize like they are competent, they are professional, they take their work seriously. They might be using Vietnam era equipment, but they're going to use the hell out of it. Um,
Hell, we were using Vietnam era
Yeah.
equipment when I was in like
right.
2002.
I mean, and I think about sometimes the average US soldier, like I often find like veteran culture a little funny because like when I joined, it was like there's a reason people in the army usually, and so they weren't they weren't always the best and the brightest. But then you even think about that, like having a very large military means that you take a broad number of people. And if you've got a
Yeah.
smaller military, you got a higher bar. And that all those things I think should be part of your world building and get to the culture of the military. If your officer's got to worry about their soldiers shooting them, or the officer is carrying a sidearm because they got to tell somebody to, they got to pull it on somebody. That's a very different culture and kind of
Yeah.
military and concept. And I mean, I don't think any U.S. officer was ever super comfortable with that. Whereas you look at a dictatorship with a culture of elitism, and things of that nature where I'm going to shoot you and I don't care about you as a human.
Yeah.
That's just very different. And how effective are they as a military versus the US that has never been very comfortable with that kind of thing and tries to push leadership as low as possible. Or maybe that was one of the lessons out of Vietnam. I don't know, but I feel like that's a cultural thing that we've kind of always had. Um, I'm digressing a little
What
bit,
I think
but
is interesting is the shift in military culture, as it pertains to like the overall culture of the nation that it is governed by, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, in the Air Force specifically, and military uniforms change over many, many times, and people make rank based on new military uniforms and all of that. But when I was in, there was a thing called elite gate guard in the special forces, or the security forces rather, and they were just gate guards. Every base has them, every military has them, but this specific unit was unique only in the fact that they were extremely diligent about their appearance, and they wore ascots, and instead of wearing BDUs, they wore the dress blues, and they wore their pants bloused, their dress pants bloused with white laces on their boots, and they were like just they looked great,
Mhm.
like from a purely like military cool looking, not as great as like Marine uniforms, but they looked cool. Definitely not practical. And I saw a post the other day. I'm a part of this special security forces military veterans group on Facebook, and somebody made a post, and they were like, we need to bring this back. And there were so like the difference of opinion on whether they were good or bad or stupid or just overplayed was just crazy. And now in the military, you can there's a thing for beards now, either based on religious preference or just even just changed appearance standards. Um, and the people that hate
The G.I.
beards
Joe
just,
from the 70s is back.
oh yeah. And the people that
Bring back
wore
dueling stars too.
the people that were elite gate guards are like, oh, it's the best time, and we need to bring that back. It's so professional. And then there's other people that are like, but it's not practical. When is the
Right.
last time like you can't do anything in them? And then some guy is like, well, when's the last time you got in a fight in Conus? Like, and it's interesting that even in a small niche group of the military, how the culture can shift between different aspects of work, and even the
Right.
people that were in that work, how they viewed it. And that just it's interesting to play with those ideas, and think of, is it practical or is it functional? Or it's like the military parades that China and North Korea put on, where they spend millions of dollars in parading hundreds of thousands of
You should
troops.
see you should
And
see the ones in Middle Eastern countries where they
yeah,
have where they have these little demonstrations with troops doing all these acrobatics and stuff.
yeah. Or it's like the ceremonial thing between I think it's Pakistan and uh it's Pakistan and somebody, I can't remember, but there was this border conflict that happened many, many years ago, and now there's this ceremony that happens
Is it in
where
Kashmir?
soldiers from, it might be, but
Where is
they
it
wear
from?
these, like, it's Pakistan and
I mean,
and one of their
India
neighbors.
India is their enemy, but I don't know if it's another.
It might be India, but
Yeah.
they wear like these ceremonial helmets that have like those, the Roman helmets that have
Yeah.
the fur or
Flesh
whatever
kind
on
of thing.
top.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they've got these decorative uniforms, and they do these like really dramatic marches where they're kicking their leg up and slamming it down, and it's all posture. And they do it at this ceremony at the border, and both sides are like doing this like kind of posturing ceremony. And
Yeah.
it's hilarious when you watch it. You're like, what is going on? But they like take that shit
Well, it's
seriously.
like ritualized
Um,
combat, you know?
yeah, but it's interesting seeing, like, I can't remember, there was a video that went around last year from, I think it's Uzbekistan or one of the smaller countries, where this ceremonial guard were like marching, and they did some kind of parade maneuvers, but the cadence that they was calling, this guy had like a really gruff like, and they were doing this thing. And the difference in ceremonial like military uh parade
Like a
and stuff like
Sadhukar
that.
throat singer.
Mhm.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. But the difference in that, and then you look at like U.S. military ceremony, the one that comes to mind is like the changing the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is very subdued and very stoic and serious. And then you have these other ceremonies that are as important to the people that are performing them as the one that I'm talking about, but they're just so different in terms of presentation and experience. I love that kind of thing, and I love looking at like the history of why that is. And you know, a lot of those little things are really kind of nut and bolt, and you can't do a lot of them in fiction because they're neat, but sometimes you've got to cut out all the fluff in your story, and you don't get a lot of time to kind of explore those elements. But even just tangentially touching on them, it can really expand, like we've talked about, the depth in your civilization or the depth in your military, to a point where it feels more real than just a guy with a gun marching on a field. You know what I mean?
No, I think culture is so huge. I mean, look at honor culture and like decisions commanders would make, like Japanese commanders or kamikaze culture, or like those things that existed in that specific period of time that
Yeah.
could not exist today. And even that level of conflict, you know, where we treat I mean, I would hope that we treat human life with more importance now than we used to. But, you know, commanders just thinking no big deal that, you know, in World War One, the thousands and thousands that would die. And they were just like, whatever. Like I was in 1917, the commentary on it, like they have a historian who's talking about like the movie was, you know, relatively realistic, but the only thing that he just didn't buy was the central conceit that anybody would give a shit about, or I'm sorry, anybody would care about that one regiment that was about to, you know, charge to their deaths, because in the grand scheme of things, that just wasn't the way those commanders thought. Like, you know, they didn't blink at losing 20,000 or whatever.
I remember, I can't remember which podcast it was. It was oh man, I can't. It's a historical podcast, and he did like a series on World
Dan
War
Carlin,
One. Yeah,
hardcore history.
yeah, hardcore history. Yeah, and they were talking about World War One, and they around along the Maginot line. I think that's what it's
Maginot.
called.
Maginot. Not the Menage a
They
Trois
trans-
line.
Menage a Trois
yeah,
line, yeah.
where they where the bodies of the attackers that were attacking the bunkers got stacked so high that the machine gunners in the bunkers couldn't shoot the people behind them because the bodies were stacked higher than the gun turret could shoot. And I have a problem like visualizing that, right? Like that's so crazy to me that the amount of death and destruction, and even the amount of sheer like artillery rounds that were fired every minute and every hour during that conflict was just like so astronomical that it's really hard to conceive of in modern day terms. But I mean, like you said, that was just normal. Like they were like, "Yep, go die."
Yeah, and that's why World War One was such a traumatic experience for the entire world. They lost a generation of people.
Yeah,
in Europe.
Well, and that's the thing. You think of like, if we were going to just be cold about it and put it in economic terms, you think of like the potential economic value of each of those people and what they might have invented or created, or,
yeah.
You know, which again, I think it's like Poland when they lost, what was the massacre that the Soviets perpetrated, in the forest. I don't know. They killed like 20,000 people, like all their officers. And
I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the name of it.
I could look it up, but you basically, just that brain drain.
The Caitlin massacre.
Kipton or
Caton Force.
Caitlin Force massacre.
Yeah. 21,857 military officers.
Yeah. And that was when everybody thought Stalin, we could still work with Stalin. But anyway, that was, you just think about that brain drain, like just the effect of that on a country for generations, to lose that. Like Poland, like we were talking about, you know, military, like how effective a military is. And if you just take out their officer corps, and then expect them to go fight for another 4 years, like that's also a world building. I don't know, just so many details like this that you could play into the effects of where your people are now trying to solve problems. And it's not far-fetched to imagine those things happen, because they did. So,
right.
Yeah.
I feel like we've only barely scraped the surface of this.
I know we've been talking for an hour, and I don't feel like we've done gone anywhere really significant.
Well, it's
such like a part 2 on this next time.
We could.
For sure.
It just feels like there's so many, like the military aspect of world building it's just so much deeper, I think, than people think a lot of times. Like, because, you know, what is a military solution but trying to solve politics by other means? Or like we've reached a point culturally where now we're at war. Or if it's not, like maybe it's a corporate war. I don't know. There's so many ways we could look at it. So
Yeah.
this is probably a good stopping place. We will put a pin in it and can maybe come back for number 2. Um, so if you've got ideas about things you like about military world building or military world building that really, we'd love some examples of books you think do it well. I don't really care about books that do it badly. I don't have time to read them. But I would love to. I would love to read stuff that you thought worked really well. Because that's always interesting. I don't know. I'm always looking for good things to read anyway. The new Christopher Raccio book just dropped actually, and
Yeah, I know.
in fact, I'm angry at Amazon because they tore up the cover on it, so I already got a return coming.
Oh
So
no.
I know.
The covers on my ebooks never get torn up.
Yeah,
Nah.
I know.
It's on my list. Well, we could talk about it after the recording because it really doesn't have any bearing on it. But,
I know.
it's on my list. I am excited to read it.
Yep. I would recommend it if you're looking for some I wouldn't call it like realistic military science fiction, but it is it's fun stuff to read. It's epic, like
Yeah.
Josh said. So
For sure.
anyway, thank you for hanging out with us, and we will see you next time. Later.
Lone out troopers on a hidden jump gate. Military science fiction podcast.